We have a massive problem. I just ran some numbers, and deaths of despair are absolutely skyrocketing. Now, three times the rate during the Great Depression, doubling over the past 2 decades alone. You're working harder than ever, but for millions of Americans, life is crumbling into despair, literally killing them. The social contract was defaulted on, and these metrics tell the real story. So, for those that are not familiar, there is a term in sociology known as death of despair or disease of despair. I will link this in the description of the video, along with this paper that was conducted by the Joint Economic Committee of the United States Congress. So, this is a well known, respected phenomenon that has been discussed for a long time. As we can see, they compiled data for these various individual components of deaths of despair and then the total. And they compared the data all the way up through 2017. And we could see that as of 2017, it averaged about 46 total deaths per 100,000 Americans. Now, this is not a gross amount. This is a per capita rate. So, this is talking about not the total amount of these individual deaths, but the rate per 100,000. And we can see that it gone absolutely parabolic since 2000. And we'll get into some of the causes and what might be correlated with that in a second here. But we could see that as of 2017, it was about 46 deaths of despair total per 100,000 Americans. Well, all morning I got the data to update that chart, and I spent some time updating that chart. And as we can see, it has gotten exponentially worse. So, deaths of despair are now triple the rate that they were during the Great Depression at 60. They have increased 2.7 times since 2000. So, just over the past 25 years, deaths of despair have increased by 2.7 times, almost 3 times in just the past 25 years. Drug overdose deaths are now 5 times the rate they were during 2000. And alcohol related deaths are 4.6 times higher than they were in the Great Depression. Here's the S&P 500 going back to 1871. Here are deaths of despair linked. I sync the dates, right? So 1890 here is the chart for deaths of despair, and is the same for the S&P 500 chart. And we can see just as the S&P 500 has gone straight vertical over the past 25 years, so have deaths of despair. A follower pointed out that is pretty correlated to the share of total U.S. wealth owned by the top 1%, or excuse me, top 0.1% of families. And again, I synced the dates there so that you can compare the two there. Here is the full chart, and you can also find it on my X account with, of course, all the citations for the various components that went into updating from 2017 onward. I plotted a data point at 2020 and then another one at 2023. There is a bit of a lag, but 240,000 Americans are dying every single year. 250,000 Americans die from an economic death of despair. This is absolutely insane. And we'll get into some of the causes in a second. By the way, there's the full opacity chart of the share of total U.S. wealth. Again, I will link this report in the description. They go through and talk about it in more detail and examine individual components in more detail there. And of course, the Wikipedia article goes into some of the causes. One of them mentioned is neoliberalism. Well, let's take a look at that. Globalization, right? Remember, when a country runs a very large trade deficit, the other way of saying that on a balance of payments basis, that trade deficit must get balanced out somehow. Well, the way a trade deficit gets balanced out is by a capital and financial account inflow. So one thing you can look at is the current account, which is mainly comprised of the balance of trade, inverted. It is a mirror image of that capital and financial account. So this is annualized data. So I multiplied the quarterly data by 4, and we can see currently about $1 trillion current account deficit per year. But again, the other way of saying that is that $1 trillion every single year must flow into financial assets here in America, whether that be real estate, stocks, US treasuries were a large component of that for a long time. And of course, it is deeply, tightly correlated with the net worth of the top 1% as a share of GDP. So remember what the red line is showing. Both of these are going up. Net worth of top 1% is going up and to the right. GDP is also going up to the right. What the red line is showing you is the degree to which the net worth of the top 1% is increasing at a faster rate than underlying GDP. And of course, there was a bit of a divergence here back in the early 2010s. Well, of course, that was when QE2 and QE3, a massive Federal Reserve operations, started back in the early 2010s. And the other thing that Wikipedia talks about is the division between capital and labor. Well, here we can look at that division. The S&P 500 we can see is up 8,290% since the end of the gold standard. Sounds great, but the only problem is the average hourly wage is only up 814%. So, put another way, the S&P 500 has grown 10 times faster than the average hourly wage. If wages had kept up with the S&P 500, which again is supposed to approximate the publicly traded companies of the US economy, if wages had kept up, the average hourly wage would be $310 per hour. Now here, we're looking at the S&P 500 divided by the average hourly wage, and what we can see is going back to 1990, so just over the past 35 years since globalization really kind of accelerated, we can see the S&P 500 has outpaced the average hourly wage by 615%. But wait, it gets worse. If you thought that was bad, just look at the S&P 500 total return. This includes dividends from those stocks and then divided by the average hourly wage. Well, that has outpaced wages by 1,416%. And of course, if we go back to this chart, Deaths of Despair, we can see that it went absolutely vertical in 2000. Well, again, one of the things that happened back in the early 2000s was globalization really kind of accelerated. We could see that with the current account, as we can see here. The current account deficit back in 1997 was only about $120 billion per year. Now we are talking about $1 trillion per year, so more than a 10x. And again, remember what that means. The other way of saying that is there has been a 10x in terms of the amount of capital, foreign capital, that must mechanically flow into U.S. financial assets, whether that be real estate, U.S. treasuries, or stocks. Now, I did the math going back to 2011. Those capital inflows into just real estate and of course, mortgage-backed securities and REITs. If you total up all that money that has flowed from foreigners into either directly purchasing real estate in the form of foreign direct investment or purchasing mortgage-backed securities or REITs, it equates to about 700,000 single-family homes. And that is just the real estate component of these inflows, of course. So that is a huge driver. This has made corporations, their profit margins, obscenely large, right? And none of that has ended up trickling down to the average American, unfortunately. And here I marked 2000, which again is when Deaths of Despair started to just go absolutely parabolic. I marked that here, and then I showed a couple different ways of thinking about the real economy. So the S&P 500 in gold terms, well, that peaked in 2000. Personal income as a share of the M2 money supply, so the purchasing power of that personal income, that peaked in 2000 as well. The labor force participation rate, just what it sounds like, that peaked in 2000. And of course, the average hourly wage in gold terms also peaked in 2000. And here we can see since the end of the gold standard, these different metrics. Personal income as a share of the M2 money supply, so again, reflecting purchasing power of that income, is down 17%. Now, if you take it from 2000, it's down by about 40%, as we can see, 25% plus 17. If you look at total civilian wages, the total amount that every American earns in wages as a share of GDP, that is down by 33% since 1971. If we look at the average hourly wage as a share of the average home price, that is down by 53%. And finally, if we look at the average hourly wage as a share of GDP, this is per capita average hourly wage per person, that is down by 67% as a share of US GDP. So again, the question becomes, what is going on with the US economy if this is what Americans feel? This is a direct reflection of the economic reality that Americans actually feel on the ground. Anyways, hopefully this was helpful. Again, all the citations and a full resolution chart are provided on my X account. You can go check that out. Anyways, hopefully this was helpful. We got to do something about this. Of course, we have to balance the trade deficit. That is a major component of this, of course, fueling wealth inequality, fueling the K-shaped economy, fueling the hyper financialization of the US economy, which has led to some of this obscene wealth inequality, which, by the way, is worse now in 2025 than in the Gilded Age, which was so bad that we named an entire era of American history after how bad the wealth inequality was. Well, it's even worse in 2025 today. So we got to do something about this. One of the first steps we can take is to, of course, balance trade. But that is just one of many problems facing the US economy. And again, this chart tells the real story about how Americans are really doing. So anyways, hopefully that was helpful. Have a good weekend, and I'll catch you in the next one.